Hi, my name's Dawn Davies,
My name is Dave Broom.
and we are here today to talk to you about whiskies from the British Isles, can't even say it, and of course Ireland. And I think what we've seen, definitely in the last 10 years, is a massive explosion of not only new distilleries, but actually new styles of whiskies. There's a lot, it feels like there's a lot going on.
There's a huge amount going on. I mean, you think about it, 10 years ago, how many distilleries were there in England? And now there's 30, maybe 35. In Ireland, when I, admittedly, I've been writing about whiskey for quite a while. But, I remember in the 1990s, there were 2 distilleries operational in Ireland. Now there's 35, maybe moving up to 40. It's extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary what's happened in a very, very short space of time. This hasn't been over 20 odd years, it's been over the past decade.
And I guess if we kind of take Ireland as the problem, because I think I'm seeing a lot of Irish whiskey. I'm very lucky. I get samples all the time on different whiskies and things. And a lot of it's Irish, but a lot of it's from those same distilleries.
Yeah.
And I think what I'm waiting for is this generation that's going to come probably in the next 5 years, where we're going to actually see those new distilleries coming on board and creating something really unique and different. And I think what I'm slightly nervous about is Ireland almost kind of hindering itself because you're getting just a lot of whiskies that are bottled under a brand. Do you think there's a danger in that, or do you think actually there's enough excitement coming behind that will support it?
Yeah, I can see a reservation, but I do think genuinely, a lot of the new distillers are trying incredibly interesting things. The way that Boan, for example, is looking at ancient single pot still recipes, and the fact that the single pot still regulation is changing as a result of historical research going, there was always more than one way of doing this, and that's kind of opened up the whole field. I think for distillers to start exploring. Look what Peter Ryan's doing down at Blackwater. You look at Dingle, you look at Meikle,
Teeling.
Teeling, so you've got Teeling coming on stream, you've got Tullamore really building up, you've got distilleries with scale and with size, as well as some really, really fascinating smaller ones as well, and bonders like Louise, at J.G. Corey.
And I think that's where it's interesting, is it's not just the new guys that are doing some interesting things. You look at Middleton and Method and Madness range, and what's going on in there, and that's their sort of experimental side. To everyone out there, I've just tried Powers in a new form, which is insanely awesome, which I can't talk about. Well, if you're looking in 2023, I would have released it, but but this.
Well, yeah, it's a reboot. People say it's a renaissance, and I don't think it's a complete reboot of the Irish whiskey industry, and every company is involved in it, and that's the beauty of it. It's not just, this is the way Irish whiskey was made, and this is what everybody else is going to have to follow. The field is open, and it's re-examining what Irish whiskey was, and also actually what Irish whiskey could be. So it's not hampered by tradition or.
I think that's what's exciting about it. Is there's of course there's a framework of rules which people have to adhere to. But there's still, and we'll talk about a lot more, I think, when we talk about Scotch, but there's definitely a sense of innovation. And I don't like the word innovation because I think it's overused at the moment, but I do think it's relevant if we're talking about Ireland, because there is a lot of kind of, we talk about, so if you're just following this one for the first time, we've also done, this is part of a series looking at world whiskies, and we actually discussed the use of not just oak being used in whiskey, and Ireland is one of those countries that do allow, and we've seen chestnut oak used, which is for me actually absolutely delicious. It's one of my favorites of the Method and Madness expression. So I think there is definitely something super exciting around Ireland. I just hope the market's not flooded by brands that are just bottling. A lot of the stuff I try is the same stuff. So I think it's really, maybe, is it about having the knowledge of who to look out for?
I think to some extent it is, yes. I think that the stocks of all that whiskey that a lot of the bottlers were using is now diminishing. So there's less and less of that. IDL aren't releasing. None of the big guys are releasing. GNDR, but very few. So that pool that did exist a few years ago is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Therefore, I think there's going to be a natural kind of weeding out, and the new quality distillers will really begin to rise. And the next few years are hugely excited for Ireland. I'm so excited about what's coming up.
I actually think it's probably one of the countries I'm looking forward to the most in terms of what's coming up. I think we've been seeing in other countries things happening. I think Ireland, we're on that cusp of just some really awesome liquid, and Bowen's is definitely one that I was very fortunate to try last year with you, and just blew my mind.
Stuff. Yeah,
incredible.
And it's good. It's a frustrating thing about whiskey, folks. It takes time. It's almost that thing. Why aren't these new things being done in whiskey? Well, they are. They just take a while to come out. So it might take 3 years, 5 years, or 10 years. It doesn't mean it's not happening. So be mildly patient about Ireland, but by God, something amazing is about to happen.
And that's great. And I think actually, if we kind of segue beautifully into the UK, or England if we're going to be really specific. Thank you. I knew you were going to give me trouble. I was like, I'm going to get in trouble as soon as I said UK. I was like, I'm going to be killed by Dave. But I think England's almost kind of, it almost feels like, so we always had the English Whisky Company, which has, for years been doing some really great stuff in the distillery, and we've become comfortable.
Yes,
I would say with that as a style.
David Fitt's an amazing distiller.
Incredible, and super sad he's now left. But I think we've always had that as a kind of the distillery in England. But suddenly, I mean, there's distilleries I didn't even know were producing whiskey. That suddenly someone from Dartmoor emailed me the other day. I was like, how did I not know? And they were like, yeah, we've got loads of bottles. So I was like,
and
where?
It's delicious.
And it's delicious. Yeah. White Peak just launched their whiskey literally a couple of months ago. There's so many, and they're small. But do you think that England has a sense of itself yet? Do you think there's again, is it kind of like we've had? I mean, how English Whisky Company is over 50? Is it about 15 years now?
Yeah, at least. Yeah.
So what is English whiskey? Is it a thing? Is it still very much kind of trial and error?
It's still, it's at that point, which I think is probably the most important point, which is is it whiskey made in England, or is it English whiskey? I think it's, to some extent, it's still whiskey being made in England, and I just think it's quite got to that English whiskey side. Not that doesn't mean it has to be a single unified style of it, but I'm searching for identity in there. But there are some amazing drams which are coming out, and I suppose that diversity of style is the enjoyable thing and the fascinating thing. You compare Spirit of Yorkshire to which is beautiful, clean, sweet, fruity, gorgeous, to lakes. Where Deval Gandhi, who's just extraordinary mind, is working pretty much exclusively with sherry casks. Boom, you've got real, almost like diametrically opposed approaches to making whiskey. But they're both in England. You look at what Bimber are doing, what East London are doing. There's Dartmoor is different again. Maybe that diversity is the joy. Is
maybe the signature in a funny way. And I guess England, and I'm maybe going to be shocked by every English person out there, but I guess England's always been a country that's taken a lot of influence from everywhere else. If you look at now the heritage of food, if you look at wine, if you look at the spirits, everything's been kind of almost pulled from different areas. So maybe it actually does make sense that English whiskey is a variety of styles and shapes and flavors and colors, because that would make sense in almost the hodgepodge of English culture, which is definitely, I think, for me, having kind of seen especially the evolution of food in the UK. I started out working in restaurants when food was like fish and chips, like some other dodgy stuff. Now look at it today. But now look at it today. It pulls from different cultural heritages, pulls from different kind of flavour profiles. And actually, if we're talking about English whiskey, you should probably pick up the first one, the East London single malt. But do you think maybe that's actually it? Is that's England's signature? Is diversity?
Yeah, diversity. Yeah, it's a diverse country. What is England? You begin to a very, very deep philosophical argument. Can a Scotsman answer that?
No rabbit hole.
But there's a fundamental difference between Yorkshire and Cornwall. So shouldn't the whiskies be different? I think as long as the whiskey is, as long as it speaks about who is making it, and as long as it's made with care and attention and integrity, and as long as that idea of the whiskey maker is coming to the fore, then it is valid. I don't think you should corral whiskey into saying, well, it's coming from here, therefore it has to taste in that particular way, which was the downfall of the Appellation system in France. Well, this doesn't taste like it's meant to. That's the wrong way to go.
It does not taste of Moroccan wine.
You kind of have to have legislation. You have to have boundaries, but at the same time, you have to have room to play. And English distillers are quite rightly playing it.
And I think actually that's where I think East London has been very clever. It's London. That's already something super interesting about that. But they've got the single malt launched. I think the first one was 3 years ago. Mm-hmm. I can't actually remember. It was either just before lockdown or after. But then they've also done a rye, and I think they've got two very different styles. Yeah. But still really valid. Both of them still have the imprint of East London and their distillery character. And if any of you are based in London or come to London, go down, visit them, because they're such a great bunch. And
I love it. Yeah, I think it's really great.
It's got a lovely malty. Yeah, the bottle's
it is very nutty, actually. It's cereal forward.
But actually, with a lovely kind of dry kind of. I don't think we talk about texture enough when we describe drinks. And I was talking in terms of fabric, and for me, this is almost like kind of, what's burlap.
Yeah. That lovely
little kind of sort of grippiness to it. But
not that I've eaten a lot. Clearly Dawn has, but
I lick fabrics.
But you're right, and you compare that, it's that wonderful kind of crunchiness, real physicality to it, to the real kind of gentle softness of something like Cotswolds, which somehow manifests the Cotswolds.
And you think, actually, it's really funny you say that, because, you think of Cotswold stone and that very sort of almost regularity about the Cotswolds. There's something sort of slightly, rolling hills, and you're right, it does, and I think. If we pick up Wales, because I think we can't not talk about Wales if we're talking about the British Isles and Ireland. See, look, I'm learning, folks. I'm learning.
I can see her squirming now.
I'm like, how do I say this and make it sound super smooth? I can't. But like if you look at Penderyn, for example, that sort of really almost slightly tropical kind of fruit that comes through in Penderyn, it definitely has that kind of Welsh conviviality, can I say?
You can say, yes, I don't think you'd be wrong. And it's isn't that the joy of whiskey? The joy of whiskey is exploring flavors and finding the flavors that you like, and you're not going to like every single one that's out there, but the range and the variety are so enormous these days, and countries that you thought, I remember the days, when English Whiskey Company started up and sort of, and they came over to Japan, they were doing whiskey shows over there, or even whiskey shows here, and people were walking past the stand because it was kind of, you're not allowed to make whiskey in England, and they just go, hello, no. And now, you go to the whiskey show and boom, every single stand is rammed because that. And I don't think it was a prejudice, it was just a kind of misunderstanding. It was just kind of, whiskey has to be made in Scotland or America or Canada or, maybe Japan.
It's that sense of familiarity.
It's just this thing called whiskey.
Yeah. And I think that's, hopefully, if you taste all through the 4 packs that we have, you'll really start to get that sense that we're not asking you to like every single one, because actually we're all different. We've picked ones that we genuinely like, but like if you don't like a certain style, you may not like it. You know, like there's peated ones, there's ones that are super spicy, and that's what's so amazing. So when people say to me, I always have a thing. If someone says to me they don't like any type of alcohol, that's like a red flag to a bull. I'm like, I will find you one. But it's so easy when you have such a diversity of flavor, exactly. And I think that's where I think we're now in an age that it's so exciting.
Yes, and the people's minds have opened. That I think it's wonderful. It's great.
And I think, you know, like you've just picked up on it. You know, like people would walk past things like the English whiskies and things like that, and go naturally to the Scotch whiskies and the Irish whiskies. And you know, we've got 2 Scotch whiskies that we're going to kind of look at right now, and I think we've touched on this in one of the other sessions, but there's this idea that it's Scotch whiskey. It can't evolve because it has rules and regulations and laws. And how can it then be something different, or how can it innovate within itself? But, you know, I think we've definitely seen, and I hope it's almost spurred on by the fact that there's so many other whiskies out there that people can try now. The Scotch whiskey distillers are like, hold on. You know, there's great liquid out there. We've got to up our game.
Yeah.
And, you know, how valid do you think that is?
Oh, no, I think it's a very valid comment. And, you know, about that regulation, you know, it's been a stick to kind of beat the Scotch whisky industry with, you know, all these regulations, you know, and it's restricting innovation, and it's not. And I think to some extent the industry almost believed it, you know, but there was no competition. To come back to your point, there was no competition. Therefore, well, we can just continue to make the whiskey in the way that we want to, in a more kind of efficient way, but making really good stuff. Yeah, whereas if you look at the Scotch whisky regulations, which are the gold standard for every other legislation in the world, you know, you can see the amount of flex that's in there. You know, you can use whatever yeast you want. You know, yes, you have
and
to
yeast
use
is one of the biggest flavour providers in the planet.
Yeah, you can use different oaks. You can play around with things. There's a lot of flex that actually already exists within the Scotch whisky regulations. And I think the new distillers who haven't been, this is not criticising what went on in the past, but, you know, who haven't been kind of restricted to the fact that you were either producing whisky for a blend or a style was fixed as far as your single malt was concerned. If you're a brand new distillery, such as Razi,
here's one we prepared earlier.
The field is open as long as you play within the rules. So I think there's just this freedom of expression, freedom of thinking that's going on in Scotland, which replicates what's going on around the world.
And, you know, and we've talked about how many new distilleries in Ireland. When we were talking about France, we were talking about how many there. You know, we tend to think probably that Scotland, okay, there's that many distilleries, that's it. But there's a huge amount of, how many new distilleries?
There's 140, right. When I first started writing about whiskey, there were 70 distilleries operational.
That was a long time ago.
Yeah, there were 70 distilleries working in Scotland. There's 140 now.
Wow. And
growing, and the majority of them have been in the past decade.
Yeah. And,
you know, it's, you know, so this idea that Scotland is staying put and any new Scotch distillery is simply following that template ain't true, because, you know, if you look at Razi, one, you know, which is a distillery that I love and have been to many times now. As Alistair Day, who's one of the co-founders, says, it's a distillery that's was designed by a blender. You know, so you've got, you know, your wash bags with where you can turn on cooling jackets or not. You've got stills with cooling jackets that can be turned on or off, purifier pipes on or off, rectifying plates on or off, producing a multiplicity of different styles. So the ability to create different flavours, and then using 3 different types of casks but 2 different types of whiskey. So that gives you 6 components already as a blender to be able to play with. And it's a Japanese approach. You know, it's a Japanese approach.
And I think, you know, that's it. We were talking about Japan and how they're distilling in an earlier talk, but, you know, I think, is that where actually these distilleries that are new have an advantage? Because it's very hard. I was talking to Adam Hannett from Brookladdy, and we were talking about like retrofitting into old distilleries, because You don't want to, your still character, your washbacks and everything, give your final whiskey the character. So you don't want to, like, change all of that and change your whiskey character. Whereas actually these guys have the ability to do some stuff that wasn't available to the distillers.
Yes,
even 10 years ago, probably.
And you're also coming in fresh. So if you're in a new distillery, such as Razi, and you're coming into an already cluttered single malt market, you're not going to take on Glenfiddich head to head. You from a purely business point of view, you kind of got to go, I've got to do something different, as long as it's not contrived, as long as it's high quality, but I have to search for something which is going to, set me apart from this enormous clutter which exists within just Scotch. And then you think about all the other single malts which are coming out from around the world.
And this is lovely.
And they do it.
And the texture on this is just beautiful. I mean, you have the pack. It's just this lovely, almost cotton softness. I almost feel like I'm sleeping on a down pillow. That texture is just lovely. But a little hint of smoke.
Little hint of smoke, yes. The peated style, unpeated style. Dark fruits like smoke, but getting the fruit into the distillate rather than coming from wine casks or whatever. Rye casks being used, chinkapin, and and red wine casks.
Just so absolutely delicious. And I'm not a red wine cask fan. Yeah, but I think these guys have done a really fabulous job on this.
Great.
And it's funny, I'm very fortunate. I get to taste a lot of things, and I get to taste sort of when they're sort of first coming on board and things. And then sometimes you just don't get to taste again because. So actually coming back and tasting after probably maybe this is, I think I don't know how many batches we're on now, but there's evolution there.
Yes, there is
and
evolution.
That's what's exciting about some of these young guys.
Yes, exactly. And it's getting bigger, but there's also quite rightly they and Ardna Merkin who are again off the scale growing. Releasing by batch. So there will be variation between the batches. One might be slightly smokier, one might be slightly less smoky. Distillery character will stay the same. So amazing stuff taking place and new ways of thinking in Scotch. Some of which are actually very old ways of thinking, like what Phil and Simon are doing up at Dornoch, which is a new approach to
crazy,
really old, barley varieties, etc. But
and playing
amazing
yeast
things.
And everything, and I think that's it. It's that new wave of kind of that new those young distillers coming through and actually making it work. And even in the traditional distilleries, we've just seen Richard Patterson handing over the reins to Greg Glass, and that's going to herald. It won't change what Dalmore is. It won't change what Jura is. It'll just adjust it and it'll change with the times. And I think also within the big distilleries we're seeing some really interesting things. And like you take a mammoth like Johnny Walker, and they were the ones first playing around with, and the next one we'll kind of pick it up, but they were playing around with different cask types before it was even allowed to be done, because they wanted to see what the effects were, and actually it's probably a good time to pick up the Kilhoman. Segue. The king of segue.
So good.
So smooth. Like a down pillow.
Wow.
This is the Kilhoman that we've released ourselves, and this is, we decided to do two different casks with them. We did a mezcal finish and we did tequila finish, and I'm not gonna lie to you, I was suspicious. I was like, this is gimmicky. Suddenly, like, all these people are doing these slightly crazy cask finishes, and I'm not a finish person. I feel that aging is better than finishing because it allows more character to go into the whiskey, and but I love Anthony. I love what the guys there do, and I was just like, okay, let's try it. And we called a couple of cask samples down, and the guys were great. They sent it, and I just remember sticking my nose in it and going, I actually smell tequila. And the mezcal one in my head worked, because that slightly smoky kind of character you can get on some mezcals, but tequila, I was like, how's that going to work? And then actually when I thought about it, I smelled it, I was like, there's a greenness to Kilhoman, and there's a greenness to tequila. And I was just like, damn.
Yeah. No, if it works, it works. And it's, the thing about tequila and mezcal is that they are quite fragile spirits, and they're not good in wood. You put tequila in oak for too long, it's destroyed. So Agave's really subtle.
It's pure.
So you want that kind of really quite tired cask, and then that you're going to be aging the tequila or mezcal in, and then that kind of short period in finishing. So you're getting the agave character coming through. So it's not whiskey and tequila, but it's whiskey and that little bit of wood, and just that subtle, that slightly decayed fruit, that slightly overripe fruit that
slightly
you get,
cheesy.
the grassiness, the pepperiness, and it just works so well with something like Kilhoman, which has got elements of that already existing within the distillery character.
And I think what we're seeing now I'm not the biggest fan of marketing, and a lot of whiskey production is now driven by marketing, but sometimes it's right. And for me, some of these kind of rum cask finishes are working super well, but at least there's a history of rum in Scotland. Now, you did a brilliant piece for Scottish Rum Fest a couple of years ago, looking at that and that history of rum, and so there's certain things that do make sense.
Yes.
And I think if you maybe didn't have an Islay whiskey that was quite green, if you put this into something like a Speyside, maybe like a more kind of heavy sherry driven, it wouldn't work.
Yeah. It's got to work. I mean, you've got to ask the questions. That's the whole point. You have to ask the question, but you've also got to be brave enough to go, it hasn't worked, therefore we can blend it away, or we can do something else with it. This worked. Simple as that. This worked.
And I think you talk to plenty of distillers that will say, I mean, Dr. Bill has told me 100 times, like, I tried this and it didn't work. And that's, these guys are doing stuff that we don't see. They might tell us in a drunken night out, and they'll be like, why didn't you tell us you had DRC casks?
It's also that point about innovation, which is it does take time. You put it into a cognac cask, and you sit there and you wait, and then suddenly, oh well. But that is the nature of whiskey. It's a fascinating subject that we still aren't at the bottom of understanding. The way in which a distillery character like Kilhoman is going to interact with, and it should on paper.
Yeah, you think.
But in reality, does it do it? How intense is the cask? Is the cask actually
and
quite
low
in that character?
Beings as casks,
Yeah, this is a cracker.
And I think it's really interesting you said that, because I think that's the nail on the head, really, isn't it? It's like we just don't. I mean, Dave and I have done over, especially the last 2 years, a lot of talks, but I think I learned so much over those 2 years because we were really going into depth onto subjects like yeast, like onto oak, like onto grains, and I think it really was so fascinating. You just understood we're just on the tip of the iceberg here.
Yes.
This is, I think, the most exciting era of whiskey.
I think so. And a lot of it driven by sustainability. If you talk about barley there, you look at what International Barley Club have done. Scotch Whisky Research Institute. Dr. James Brosnan. They're as the leading scientists going. We've got all our eggs in one basket. We have to find solutions to new barley varieties which will cope with climate change. Etc. Plus flavour. So it's a hugely exciting time. And
on that
times
note,
like this, but in a good place.
We should cheers to that. I mean, hold on, Sláinte from the British Isles and Ireland to you.
Jeez. Not you. Yeah.